The fluorescent light above me buzzed softly, casting a cold, white glare over the small ER room. It was midnight, but my body no longer registered time the way it used to. I lay there in a stiff hospital bed, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. My jaw strapped tightly in place, the taste of copper and gauze still lingering on my tongue. My head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. My right cheek was already swelling skin, stretched tight and hot, and every shallow breath made my ribs feel like they were being pried apart from the inside. I gripped my phone with trembling fingers. The nurse had stepped out after checking my vitals, leaving me alone with the machines that beeped steadily at my side. I scrolled to my father's number. Even after everything, a part of me believed he might surprise me. I pressed call and held the phone against my ear. It rang twice before he answered, his voice low and gravelly like I had woken him. "Dad," I said, forcing the words through a mouth that could barely move. "I am in the ER." Emily smashed my jaw. Silence. For a heartbeat, I thought the line had dropped. Then came the sound I will never forget. A short, sharp laugh, not of disbelief, but of amusement. "Well, maybe you finally learned not to talk back," he said. My eyes fixed on the speckled ceiling tiles above me. His voice was flat, almost casual, like we were discussing the weather, not the fact that his eldest daughter had just assaulted me hard enough to send me to the hospital. I did not reply. I could not. The pressure behind my eyes built until my vision blurred. I had called for help, for comfort, maybe for just a hint of concern. Instead, I had been told in the most unmistakable terms that I had gotten what I deserved. My jaw ached worse than before. I imagined the bone beneath the swelling fractured like porcelain under a hammer. Every swallow was fire, every breath a reminder. The metallic taste of blood mixed with the bitterness of something far more dangerous. Resentment. I lowered the phone slowly and stared at the screen until it went dark. In the silence, the truth settled over me like a lead blanket. I was alone here. Not just in this sterile hospital room, but in the larger sense that had taken root over years and years. My family was not coming. My family never came. And maybe I had been fooling myself to believe otherwise. The clock above the door clicked past 12:20. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor flatlined and voices rushed to respond. In my room, nothing moved but the slow rise and fall of my chest. I thought about the moment Emily's elbow had connected with my face, the sickening crack the floor rushing up toward me. I thought about how quickly she had left afterward, like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. That laugh on the phone told me more than any long conversation could have. Blood might connect us, but it did not bind us in any way that mattered. I pressed my fingertips against the edge of the bandage around my jaw. It throbbed under the lightest touch. My body hurt, but the wound in my chest was deeper. In that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. This would not be another forgotten injury swept under the rug to keep the family image intact. This time, there would be no quiet compliance, no swallowing the hurt in exchange for the illusion of peace. This time, they would feel it. They would see it. And when it was over, they would know without question that they had broken the wrong person. My name is Olivia, and I am 33 years old. Before tonight, I thought I understood the limits of what my family could do to me, but sitting in that hospital bed with my father's laughter still echoing in my ear, I realized I had been wrong for decades. People ask how someone ends up here, and I think the only way to understand is to start far earlier. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a modest 2-story house with my father, Robert, my mother, Linda, and my older sister, Emily, who is 3 years ahead of me. From the outside, we looked like any other middle-class family. My father worked in logistics, my mother ran a small boutique, and my sister and I attended the same public schools. But behind closed doors, the rules were different. Emily was the golden child from the moment she was born. She was loud, confident, and demanding, and my parents seemed to believe the sun rose and set on her moods. If she wanted something, she got it. If she failed at something, it was never her fault. I learned early that any conflict between us would end the same way. She would cry or pout, and my parents would descend on me with lectures about being more understanding, about being the bigger person. I cannot remember a single time Emily was held accountable for hurting me. When I was 7, she pushed me off the swings at the park. I landed hard, spraining my wrist. My mother told me not to make a scene because Emily had an important recital that night. At 10, Emily took my favorite sweater without asking spilled paint on it and then blamed me for leaving it where she could reach it. My father grounded me for a week for being careless. By the time I was a teenager, I had perfected the art of swallowing my anger. I told myself it was easier this way. I focused on school and quietly built my own life. I discovered a love for art and decided to become an art teacher. I worked hard for scholarships, put myself through college, and began teaching at a local high school. I rented a small apartment and for the first time felt a sense of independence. But Emily never stopped testing the boundaries. She would borrow things and return them damaged or not at all. She would drop by unannounced, criticize my decor, my clothes, my cooking. Every holiday became a performance where my parents ignored my accomplishments and focused on Emily's latest job promotion or vacation. There was an unspoken rule that I would accommodate her needs and swallow any resentment. I told myself I did not need their approval to be happy, but deep down, I still hoped they would see me one day. It was this hope that kept me answering their calls, attending their gatherings, and pretending that their subtle dismissals did not hurt. When Emily divorced her first husband, my parents rallied around her. They paid her rent, bought her a new car, and filled her weekends with family dinners to cheer her up. When I went through a bad breakup after a 5-year relationship, my mother told me maybe if I had been more accommodating, he would have stayed. The imbalance was glaring, but I convinced myself it was just their way. They were from a different generation, one that valued the firstborn, the louder personality, the child who demanded attention. I was the quiet one, the self-sufficient one, the one who did not make waves. And for years that identity kept me safe in a strange way. I learned to work around Emily's tantrums to brace myself for my parents' indifference. But there was always a line, and tonight she had crossed it. She had taken something from me that could not be patched over with forced smiles and empty apologies. She had turned a lifetime of small cruelties into one brutal act that could not be ignored. Sitting in that hospital bed, I realized this was not just about a broken jaw. It was about every scraped knee dismissed, every insult brushed aside, every time I was told to be the bigger person while she was allowed to be small, petty, and cruel. It was about finally deciding that enough was enough. It happened on a Saturday afternoon in early March, a day that had started quietly enough with a cup of coffee and a half-finished sketch on my kitchen table. Emily had called that morning, her voice brisk and cheerful in a way that always put me on guard. She said she was stopping by to pick up a few things for the party she was hosting that evening. I asked what things, and she listed off a series of items, including a set of delicate glass lanterns my late godmother had given me. They were one of the few gifts I had ever received from someone who treated me as if I mattered, and I told her no. She laughed lightly, as if my answer was a joke, and said she would be there in an hour. I told her again they were not available. The line went quiet for a moment before she said we would talk when she got there. I knew her well enough to understand what that meant. When the knock came an hour later, it was sharp and impatient. I opened the door, and there she was, wearing a bright red coat, a smile stretched across her face, but her eyes already assessing the room behind me. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside and began looking around as if I were an inconvenience standing between her and her goal. I told her plainly that the lanterns were not leaving my house, and that if she needed decorations, she could borrow from someone else. She tilted her head, and in that sing-song tone she used when mocking me, asked if I was really going to be selfish over a few dusty trinkets. I reminded her they were not hers to take. The smile dropped. Her expression hardened into something cold and sharp. She stepped closer until we were almost nose to nose, her perfume cloying and suffocating. "You always were the ungrateful one," she hissed. I told her to leave. She didn't. Instead, her elbow shot forward, catching me square in the jaw with a force that sent a sickening crack through my skull. Pain exploded across my face, and I stumbled backward, hitting the back of my head on the wall before crumpling to the floor. The room tilted, the edges of my vision dimming. I tasted blood immediately, warm and metallic, pooling under my tongue. My hands went instinctively to my jaw, but even the slightest touch made me want to scream. Emily stood over me, breathing hard, eyes wide, not with remorse, but with a kind of adrenaline-fueled satisfaction. "You shouldn't have talked to me like that," she said as if explaining a simple fact. Then she turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the hardwood, the sound fading as the door shut behind her. I lay there for what felt like minutes trying to piece together the sequence of events. My jaw throbbed with every heartbeat, my head ringing from where it had hit the wall. Somewhere in the fog, I heard Mrs. Keating, my elderly neighbor, calling my name from outside. She had heard the commotion through the open kitchen window. She pushed the door open and gasped when she saw me on the floor. "Olivia, what happened?" I tried to answer, but the words were garbled, the pain shooting down my neck. She wasted no time calling 911, and within minutes, 2 paramedics were kneeling beside me, fitting a neck brace around my shoulders and lifting me carefully onto a stretcher. The bright afternoon light outside was blinding as they carried me to the ambulance. The siren wailed to life, and I closed my eyes against the throb in my jaw, the cold realization settling over me. This wasn't just another petty fight. This wasn't something I could patch up or excuse away. Emily had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the family I knew would try to bury it just like they had buried everything else. As the ambulance turned toward the hospital, I thought about the conversation I was going to have and how different it would be from every conversation before. This time, I would not play the quiet sister who let things go. This time, the truth would not be silenced. The emergency room was cold in a way that made the pain in my jaw feel sharper, every breath pulling the chill deeper into my lungs. A nurse helped me sit upright while another adjusted the monitor attached to my finger. The doctor came in after reviewing the CT scan, his tone matter-of-fact, as he confirmed there was a fracture along the left side of my mandible. It would require immobilization, a liquid diet, and weeks of recovery. He explained how swelling could increase over the next 24 hours and that I should avoid talking as much as possible. I nodded through the effort made my jaw throb. When they asked who could pick me up after discharge, I hesitated. The logical part of me wanted to call a friend, someone who would actually care, but habit is a powerful thing. I reached for my phone and opened the family group chat. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I typed slowly. "Jaw is fractured. Still at ER. Can someone pick me up?" Emily had seen the message within seconds. Her profile picture flashed under the words, but no reply came. My father called instead, his voice heavy with that familiar condescension, asking if this was about the so-called accident earlier. I told him it was not an accident. Emily had hit me hard enough to send me here. His laugh was short and sharp, followed by the words that settled in my chest like ice. "Serves you right." I waited for more, maybe a question about my condition, but there was nothing. My mother's text followed a moment later. "Don't exaggerate. Your sister didn't mean it. Try to get along." I stared at the screen, the throbbing in my jaw suddenly secondary to the slow burning anger that replaced the ache in my chest. This was not new. I had been here before, not physically, but emotionally calling for help, only to be told my pain was either my own fault or not real. When I was 12 and Emily slammed a door on my hand, fracturing my pinky, my parents had insisted it was an accident, that she hadn't seen me standing there. When I was 17 and she shoved me into a pool fully clothed in the middle of winter, they told me to stop being dramatic. Tonight was simply the culmination of every excuse they had made for her. The nurse came back in with a printed aftercare plan and a small bag with ice packs. She asked again who would pick me up. I told her I was figuring it out, even as I typed a message to an acquaintance from work, someone I barely knew but trusted more than my own blood. As I waited for her reply, I could hear the sound of laughter from down the hall, the kind of laughter that felt so out of place in this sterile antiseptic space. I wondered if Emily was laughing somewhere too, maybe retelling her version of events, painting me as the instigator. My coworker responded quickly, saying she could be there in 30 minutes. I thanked her and felt an unexpected wave of relief. In the hours that followed between the nurse's visits and the doctor's final check, I thought about the years of silence I had endured, the way I had trained myself to accept neglect as normal. Tonight was a turning point. I could feel it in the way my body resisted the idea of forgiving, in the way my mind refused to rationalize their cruelty. My parents had made their position clear. My sister had made hers violently clear. That left me with one choice to decide my own position, one that did not involve swallowing their abuse anymore. As I signed the discharge papers and walked slowly toward the waiting area holding the ice pack against my jaw, I caught my reflection in the glass door. My face was swollen, bruised, and pale, but my eyes looked sharper than I had seen them in years. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Leaving the ER that night, my coworker Jenna helped me into her car with the kind of gentle care I had never known from my family. The ride was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the occasional turn signal clicking in the dark. Every bump in the road sent a pulse of pain through my jaw, making my hands tighten in my lap. Jenna offered to stay the night, but I told her I would be fine. It was a lie, but one I had grown used to telling. When she dropped me off the porch, light was out, the house colder than the air outside. I shuffled inside and immediately felt the emptiness press in on me. The silence was heavy, the kind that makes you notice every creak of the floorboards and distant hum of the refrigerator. I made my way to the kitchen looking for something soft enough to eat, but all I found was an almost empty carton of milk and some stale bread. My mother had promised she would stock my fridge last week when she visited, but promises in my family often meant nothing. The bruising in my jaw had darkened overnight, a sick mix of purple and green, and I could barely open my mouth wide enough to sip water. When I checked my phone, there were no messages from my parents, no apology, not even a pretense of concern. Instead, Emily had posted photos of her party on social media, smiling guests, champagne flutes her in the center of it all, wearing the very red coat she had on when she hit me. The caption read, "Best night with the best people." The comments were filled with friends telling her how fabulous she looked. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred, wondering how someone could so easily celebrate after leaving their own sister injured and alone. The following morning, I called my employer to explain that I would need medical leave. Speaking hurt, but the shame in my voice hurt more. Admitting I had been assaulted by my sister felt like tearing open a wound for strangers to see. My principal was kind, assuring me they would arrange for a substitute and that I should focus on healing. It was the sort of compassion I had never received from the people who shared my last name. By the third day, the bills started arriving. The ER visit, the scans, the medications, all of it, far more than my insurance would cover. I did the math twice, then a third time, and still came up short. My savings would take a heavy hit, but what choice did I have? I considered asking my parents for help just to see if they would say yes, but the thought of hearing another lecture about being self-sufficient made my stomach twist. Each night I replayed the attack in my mind. The sound of the crack in my jaw, the cold look in Emily's eyes, the deliberate way she walked out without looking back. And then my father's laugh sealing the moment in a way I could never erase. I knew them well enough to predict their next move. They would try to convince me it wasn't worth pursuing, that airing our problems would make the family look bad. But this time, I wasn't going to make it easy for them. I started small, writing down every detail I could remember about that afternoon. The exact time Emily arrived, what she said, the angle of her elbow, the way she shifted her weight before striking me. I wrote about my father's reaction, my mother's text, the absence of any concern in the days that followed. I printed screenshots of Emily's party photos, noting the date and time they were posted. I didn't know yet exactly what I would do with all of it, but I knew why I was doing it. Evidence doesn't fade the way memories do. And if my family wanted to pretend nothing had happened, I was going to make sure the truth had a record they couldn't erase. It was a week later when the idea truly took shape. I was sitting on the couch, my jaw still bound, watching the muted light of late afternoon spill across the floor when my eyes drifted to the small black rectangle mounted beside my front door. The doorbell camera had been a recent purchase, mostly to deter package theft. I had almost forgotten about it in the chaos, but now a spark of realization burned through the haze of pain and exhaustion. Slowly, carefully, I stood and went to my laptop, logging into the camera's cloud account. The footage from that day loaded in seconds. There she was, Emily, striding up to my porch in her red coat face, set with determination. I watched myself open the door, watched her push past me, the two of us disappearing inside. Moments later, the sound of shouting filtered through the audio, then the unmistakable impact of bone against bone. My body appeared in the frame again as I stumbled backward into view, my hand going to my jaw before I crumpled toward the floor. Even though the angle didn't catch every detail, the audio was damning. "You shouldn't have talked to me like that." Her voice rang out clear and sharp before the door slammed behind her. My heart pounded as I replayed it, every frame validating what I had felt in my bones, that this wasn't just my word against hers. I downloaded the clip, saved it to multiple drives, and emailed a copy to myself. Then I opened my phone and scrolled to the string of messages from my parents. My mother's text dismissing my injury, my father's laugh on the call recorded by the ER's call log, all of it lined up like puzzle pieces forming an ugly picture. That night, I researched assault laws in Oregon, my cursor hovering over words like second degree and domestic. The penalties were serious: fines, probation, community service, even jail time. I thought about the years Emily had walked away from every bad thing she'd done without consequence, protected by the shield of my parents' indulgence. The idea of her finally standing in front of someone she couldn't charm or manipulate lit something inside me that I hadn't felt in years, a sense of control. I contacted a lawyer the next morning, a woman named Sarah Pierce, who specialized in cases of domestic violence. We met in her office 2 days later. She listened without interruption as I told her everything, her pen moving quickly over her notepad. When I showed her the footage, she leaned back in her chair, eyebrows raised. "This is strong evidence," she said, "and combined with the injury and the medical records, you have a very solid case." She explained the process, what it would take to file charges, how subpoenas could secure social media posts and phone records if necessary. The more she talked, the more the fear that had been gnawing at me since that night began to shift into something sharper, more focused. Filing meant there would be no going back. My parents would hate me for it. Emily would play the victim. Old friends of the family might turn against me. But then I remembered lying on that floor, my jaw broken, listening to my father's laughter. I remembered the years of swallowing my anger to keep the peace, and I realized peace had never really existed. It had only been my silence. I told Sarah to proceed. The police contacted me a few days later to take my statement formally. An officer reviewed the footage, asked precise questions about the attack, and promised to keep me updated on the investigation. Less than a week after that, Emily was served with a summons. The news traveled fast. My phone lit up with calls from numbers I recognized but didn't answer. My mother's voicemail was clipped and furious. "What are you thinking, Olivia? This is family, not strangers. We handle our problems privately." My father's was colder. "You're making a mistake you can't undo." Emily's text came in last. "You'll regret this." I stared at their words, felt the familiar sting of their disapproval, but it didn't pierce me the way it once had. This time, I had something stronger than their approval. I had the truth and the means to show it. As the court date approached, Sarah prepared me for what would happen. She warned me Emily might try to settle to apologize in exchange for me dropping the charges. She also warned me that my parents could be called as witnesses. When I asked what would happen if they lied, she smiled faintly and said that perjury was a dangerous game to play in front of a judge. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I dressed carefully in a dark blazer, my jaw still tender but healing. I sat beside Sarah as Emily entered the courtroom, her hair styled perfectly, her face painted into an expression of mild confusion as though she were the one wronged. My parents sat behind her stone-faced. The judge called their session to order, and Sarah wasted no time introducing the video into evidence. The sound of that impact filled the quiet room, followed by Emily's voice, cold and clear. "You shouldn't have talked to me like that." My parents' faces tightened, my father's jaw clenching as the audio played on. When it ended, the judge glanced down at the papers before him, then back at Emily. "Ms. Carter," he said evenly, "this is a serious matter." And for the first time in my life, I watched my sister's confidence falter. The preliminary hearing ended with the judge setting a date for trial and issuing a temporary restraining order against Emily. She was forbidden from contacting me directly or indirectly and had to stay at least 100 yards away from my home and workplace. As we stepped out of the courtroom, reporters from the local paper were waiting. Sarah advised me to say nothing, but their questions carried far enough for Emily to hear. One of them asked how it felt to see a family member facing assault charges. Emily's mouth tightened into a thin smile as she walked past them without answering. My parents followed my mother, muttering something to my father that made him glance back at me with open contempt. That look used to break me. Now it only confirmed I had made the right choice. Over the next week, the local news picked up the story after a clerk leaked the video as part of the public court record. The headline read, "Local woman faces assault charge after attack on sister caught on camera." The footage played on evening broadcasts, each time accompanied by my name and the details of my injuries. It was surreal to watch something so personal dissected by strangers, but it also meant Emily could no longer hide behind the version of events she told her friends. The evidence was out there for everyone to see. I started receiving messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were supportive, others simply curious. A few old classmates confessed they had seen how my parents favored Emily growing up but never knew the extent of it. There was a certain vindication in hearing that my reality had been visible to others, even if no one had intervened back then. My parents' reaction was predictable. They called once to demand I issue a public statement saying I had misunderstood Emily's intentions. When I refused, my father said flatly, "You're ruining this family's reputation." I told him the reputation had been built on pretending abuse didn't happen, and if that was ruined, so be it. After that, the calls stopped. I focused on preparing for trial. Sarah walked me through possible scenarios and had me rehearse answering questions clearly and without emotion. She reminded me that the defense might try to provoke me into anger to undermine my credibility. I practiced staying calm, breathing evenly, and letting the truth speak for itself. Meanwhile, Emily's life began to unravel. The restaurant where she worked announced on social media that she had been placed on indefinite leave pending the outcome of the case. The community organization that had been planning to honor her for her volunteer work quietly removed her name from the list of honorees. Friends she had counted on for years started distancing themselves. Through it all, she sent word through mutual acquaintances that she wanted to talk to settle this privately. Each time I told Sarah the same thing, no. This wasn't about revenge for me. It was about accountability, something Emily had never faced. The night before the trial, I barely slept. I lay in bed listening to the rain tapping against the window, my mind replaying every moment from that afternoon, the red coat, the cold words, the sharp pain exploding in my jaw. But I also thought about what had followed the nurse in the ER who looked at me with concern instead of doubt, Jenna showing up without hesitation, Sarah's steady presence through every step. Those moments reminded me that I wasn't as alone as my family wanted me to believe. The morning of the trial, I walked into the courthouse feeling the weight of the day, but also a quiet strength in my chest. Emily sat at the defense table, her posture stiff, her eyes flicking toward me and away again. My parents were behind her dressed formally, their faces unreadable. The judge entered and the room rose. As testimony began, the video played once more, the sound of that impact filling the air like a gunshot. I didn't look at Emily or my parents. I kept my eyes on the judge, on the truth that was no longer just mine to carry. Whatever happened next, they could never take that away from me. The verdict was still days away when my parents showed up unannounced at my door. I had been sitting at the kitchen table sorting through bills when the knock came sharp and deliberate. When I opened the door, they stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. My mother went straight to the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood, while my father lingered near the doorway, arms crossed. "We need to talk," my mother said, her tone clipped. She sat down on the edge of the couch, smoothing her skirt the way she did before delivering news she thought was important. "Your sister is under immense stress. This trial is destroying her career and reputation." I stood there, arms folded, waiting for something resembling concern for me, but it never came. Instead, my father added, "You could end this now. Drop the charges and we can move on." "Move on," I repeated, tasting the words. Like nothing happened. Like my jaw wasn't fractured, like I didn't spend weeks unable to eat solid food, like the world didn't see what she did to me. My mother's expression hardened. "Olivia, families keep their issues private. We don't drag each other through the courts." I took a step closer so they could see the resolve in my face. "Families don't break each other's bones either." My father's voice rose. "You've made your point. Everyone knows you're upset. Let it go before you do permanent damage." I thought about every time they had said that phrase, "let it go," when I was the one hurt, the one left to pick up the pieces. My voice was calm when I said permanent damage was done the moment she hit me. The trial just makes it visible. My mother stood, then eyes narrowing. "You're doing this to punish us." I shook my head. I'm doing this because you have spent my entire life protecting her from consequences, and that stops now. You don't get to control this. You don't get to control me. My father stepped forward, his height casting a shadow over me. And what do you expect to get out of this? Money and apology. Public humiliation. I met his stare without flinching. The truth. And the truth will be public. My mother's mouth opened and closed, no words forming, her face flushed with frustration. My father's jaw tightened, but neither of them spoke again. The silence stretched until I finally said, "If you came here to convince me to back down, you've wasted your time. I owe you nothing but honesty, and you're getting that whether you like it or not." They exchanged a look, something wordless passing between them before my mother turned toward the door. As she passed me, she said quietly, "You'll regret this." I followed them to the porch, watching as they walked to their car. The engine roared to life, the tires crunching over the gravel as they pulled away. Standing there in the cool air, I felt a strange mix of sadness and liberation. They had just confirmed everything I already knew, that their loyalty to Emily outweighed any love they claimed to have for me. And that was fine. I wasn't fighting for their approval anymore. I was fighting for myself. Inside the house felt quieter, but not in the oppressive way it used to. This silence carried a different weight, one that came from knowing I had stood my ground without screaming, without breaking. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own story. The trial would go on, the truth would come out, and whatever bridges burned in the process were ones I no longer needed to cross. In the days that followed their visit, I noticed a shift inside me. The fear that had once knotted in my stomach every time I thought about confronting my family was loosening, replaced by something steadier. I began answering calls from people who offered help instead of ignoring them out of habit. A former student who had gone through her own family estrangement reached out to tell me she admired my courage. Jenna came by with groceries and stayed to make soup, filling the kitchen with the smell of garlic and herbs. The lawyer from the local domestic violence advocacy group stopped in to check on me, bringing pamphlets about financial assistance and counseling. I took them, tucking them into a drawer, knowing I would look at them when the house was quiet. At school, colleagues covered my classes without complaint, and one of them even organized a small fundraiser to help with my medical bills. It was humbling to watch strangers and acquaintances care more about my well-being than the people who had known me my entire life. The first counseling session felt awkward at first. I wasn't used to talking openly about my family without editing the truth, but the therapist's calm presence and steady questions made it easier. She didn't try to excuse their behavior or suggest ways to win them back. Instead, she asked me what I needed to feel safe, what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. No one in my family had ever asked me those questions. That realization was both painful and freeing. I started keeping a journal, jotting down small victories a night without replaying the attack in my mind, a morning where I woke without dread, a meal I could finish despite my jaw still aching. Each entry was proof that I could build a life that didn't revolve around their approval. One afternoon, while sitting at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of me, I caught sight of the potted plant Jenna had brought a week earlier. It was thriving, new leaves unfolding toward the light. I realized that was how I felt, too tentative, but growing in a direction I chose. I still had moments where the old voices crept in telling me I was selfish or making things harder than they needed to be. But I learned to counter them with reminders of the truth I was protecting myself, and that was never wrong. As the trial date drew closer, I felt less like a victim preparing for battle and more like a witness to my own resilience. This wasn't just about proving Emily had hurt me, it was about showing myself that I could face the ugliest parts of my past without being pulled back into them. When I walked into Sarah's office the week before court, she noticed it too. "You seem different," she said. "Stronger." I smiled because she was right. The girl who had once kept quiet to keep the peace was gone. In her place stood someone ready to speak, ready to be heard, and unwilling to let the truth be buried again. The trial began on a gray Monday morning, the kind where the clouds hung low over the courthouse, pressing down on the city like a weight. I walked through the front doors flanked by Sarah and an advocate from the domestic violence organization, my steps steady even though my heart was thudding in my chest. Inside the courtroom, Emily sat at the defense table in a navy dress, her hair pulled back, her face carefully composed to project innocence. My parents were directly behind her, their expressions a mask of quiet disapproval, as if they were the ones being wronged. The prosecutor opened with the video, letting the sound of the impact fill the room. Emily flinched when her own voice followed, sharp and undeniable. My jaw tightened at the memory, but I kept my eyes on the judge. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with deliberate calm. The oath felt heavy in my mouth, each word binding me to the truth I had carried for so long. The prosecutor guided me through my account from the moment Emily arrived at my door to the ride in the ambulance to the phone call where my father laughed. Each answer was measured, detailed, leaving no room for doubt. The defense tried to paint the incident as an accident, suggesting I had moved toward Emily in a way that made her elbow me unintentionally. I countered with the video's audio and the fact that Emily's words afterward were not those of someone who had made a mistake. The tension in the room thickened with each exchange. By the time closing arguments ended, I could feel the air buzzing with a quiet anticipation. The jury deliberated for 2 hours, though it felt much longer. When they filed back in, I studied their faces, searching for clues. The foreperson stood and delivered the verdict, guilty of second-degree assault. The judge sentenced Emily to a year of probation, 200 hours of community service, mandatory anger management counseling, and a no-contact order for the full term. She would also have to pay restitution for my medical expenses. As the words sank in, I felt something inside me loosen, like a knot finally untangled. My parents stood abruptly, my mother gripping her purse like a shield. My father's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second before he looked away. Emily's face had gone pale, her jaw set as she gathered her things. The bailiff handed me a copy of the no-contact order, the official seal at the top gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It was more than just paper, it was proof that the truth had prevailed. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered their microphones outstretched, but I walked past them without stopping. This wasn't about public statements anymore. It was about knowing I had stood up when it mattered most, and that there were consequences for what had been done to me. The gray clouds had begun to break apart, streaks of sunlight spilling over the city. I took a long breath, the cool air filling my lungs, and stepped forward into a future that for the first time felt entirely my own. In the weeks after the trial, the reality of the outcome began to ripple through the community. The restaurant that had put Emily on leave announced she would not be returning. The volunteer organizations she had worked with quietly removed her name from any public materials. Mutual acquaintances who once defended her fell silent or unfriended her online, unwilling to be linked to the headlines. I did not gloat, but I also did not feel guilty. Actions had consequences, and for the first time in her life, Emily was forced to face them. I focused on my own recovery, both physical and emotional. The restitution payments from Emily began to arrive each month, covering the medical bills that had been looming over me. I used the first check to pay off the remaining balance from the hospital, and the next to replace the broken door lock and repair the wall where I had hit my head. A local community center invited me to speak at a workshop about recognizing and addressing family abuse. Standing at the front of that small room, sharing my story with people who nodded in understanding, I realized I was no longer just telling it for myself. I was telling it for anyone who had been told to stay quiet, to let it go, to keep the family's image intact. My words were a mirror for their own pain, and when the session ended, several attendees stayed behind to thank me for saying what they could not. At home, I made changes that felt symbolic as much as practical. I repainted the living room a lighter color, one that made the space feel open and warm. I planted flowers along the front walkway, something I had always wanted to do but never bothered with because I had been too busy avoiding visits from Emily. Now I tended them without fear of seeing her stride up the path. I joined an art collective downtown, renting a small corner where I could paint and display my work. Creating again without the constant background noise of family tension felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. On evenings when the sun set over the city, casting golden light through my kitchen window, I found myself pausing just to take it in. These moments of stillness were the real victory's proof that my life was no longer dictated by their moods or demands. My parents kept their distance, sending only one generic card around the holidays with all 3 of their signatures, no personal notes. I read it once and tucked it into a drawer, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed anything from them. They had chosen their loyalty, and I had chosen mine to myself. The no contact order ensured Emily could not interfere, but even if it hadn't, I doubted she would dare. She had learned that I was not someone she could harm without consequence anymore. The balance of power had shifted permanently, and I intended to keep it that way. 6 months after the trial, I had settled into a rhythm that felt entirely different from the life I used to know. My mornings started with coffee in the garden I had rebuilt, the flowers blooming in careful rows, colors spilling into one another. Teaching part-time at the community college gave me enough income to stay comfortable while leaving space for the art workshops I held for survivors of domestic abuse. Those classes became more than a source of income. They were a place where people who had been silenced could speak and create without judgment. Each painting, each clay sculpture seemed to carry a story of survival, and in listening to theirs, I realized how far I had come in my own. The jaw injury had healed almost completely, leaving only a faint stiffness on cold mornings. I took that stiffness as a reminder not of weakness, but of what I had overcome. The emotional scars were slower to fade, but the distance from my family made them easier to live with. The few times my parents reached out were short and transactional questions about taxes, about a distant relative's health, never acknowledgments of what had happened. I no longer expected those acknowledgments. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a citywide event on domestic violence awareness. Standing on the stage, I spoke into the microphone with a steady voice telling the crowd how my sister's attack had forced me to break a lifelong pattern of silence. I told them about the doorbell camera footage, about the court case, about the choice to prioritize my safety over the family's reputation. When I finished, the applause was warm and sustained, but the real moment came afterward when a woman in her 60s approached me in the lobby. She said she had stayed in an abusive marriage for decades because her family told her to keep the peace. Listening to my story, she said, had given her the push to finally leave. That, more than any verdict or payment, felt like justice. At home that night, I opened the folder where I had kept all the documents from the case, the court filings, the medical records, the video stills, and I realized I no longer needed them to prove anything to myself. The proof was in the life I was living now. I sealed the folder and placed it in a box at the back of my closet. It wasn't erasing the past, but it was choosing not to let it sit in the center of my present. In the quiet of my living room, the evening light spilling over the walls I had painted myself, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. It wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of self-respect, the knowledge that I had faced down the people who had tried to control me and walked away stronger. And as I looked out the window at the garden swaying in the breeze, I knew I had created something they could never touch, a life entirely my own, rooted in truth, protected by the boundaries I had fought to build. A full year had passed since that night in the ER when I found myself at the airport, standing at the departure gate with a single carry-on bag. The ticket in my hand was for a flight to Singapore, the first time I would be returning since everything happened. I had planned the trip quietly, telling only a few close friends. The purpose was simple: to visit the place where I had once stood alone in a hospital room, to acknowledge that version of myself, and to lay her to rest alongside the fear she had carried for so long. As I waited to board, I watched families embrace in the terminal arms, wrapping tight, laughter spilling out as if no time had passed between them. There was still a small pang in my chest at the sight, but it no longer carried the ache of longing. I had built my own kind of family now. Friends, colleagues, and neighbors who showed up without being asked, who celebrated my wins and sat with me in my losses. When the flight was called, I stepped onto the plane with a calm certainty. Somewhere over the ocean, I opened my journal and began to write, not about the pain, but about the lessons that blood ties are not a guarantee of loyalty, that silence can be more dangerous than confrontation, and that self-worth is not something given, it is claimed. In Singapore, I visited the same neighborhood where I had once walked the streets in grief, trying to find the strength to handle impossible paperwork alone. This time, I walked with my head high, the humid air heavy but not oppressive. I placed a single white lily at a quiet spot overlooking the bay, a gesture not for my sister or my parents, but for myself, a marker of survival. That evening, back in my hotel room, I read a letter I had written before leaving home. It was addressed to anyone who had ever been told they were overreacting, ungrateful, or selfish for expecting basic respect. I wrote about the day my jaw was broken about the phone call, filled with laughter instead of concern about the moment I decided I would never accept that treatment again. I promised that if they chose to walk away from those who harmed them, they were not betraying family, they were honoring themselves. The next morning, I left the letter with the event organizers of a local women's advocacy group, knowing it might reach someone who needed it. On my last night in Singapore, I sat by the water as the city lights shimmered across the surface. I thought of the people who had been there for me: Jenna, with her groceries, the nurse in the ER with her steady gaze, Sarah with her unwavering belief in my case, the strangers who sent messages of support. They had been my lifeline proof that kindness often comes from places you least expect. As I boarded the flight home, I felt no urge to tell my family about the trip. There was nothing in it for them to understand or approve of. This journey had been mine alone, a final chapter in a story I had rewritten on my own terms. When the plane lifted into the night sky, I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet truth to myself. I had faced them, I had won, and I had built a life they could no longer touch.